I'd like to call this reflection C.S. Lewis, whose version of God? I'll draw it from the Chronicles of Narnia. One of the dilemmas that we often face is that C.S. Lewis has, to some degree, been co-opted by elements of the conservative evangelical world, which has made him very hard to read for many others. For example, Focus on the Family has done the major production of the Chronicles of Narnia. And when you think of Focus on the Family, one cannot help but thinking of James Dobson and the Republican tradition. So if you get someone of that perspective doing C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, the tendency is to think C.S. Lewis must belong to the Republican Party or some variation of the conservative evangelical world, which of course Lewis could never be co-opted to that. But what I'd like to do at present time is to look at the final work in the Chronicles of Narnia, The Last Battle. Some consider The Last Battle the best of the Chronicles of Narnia because Lewis is dealing with the big issue, essentially, of whose version, in this case, of Aslan, or whose version of God. And The Last Battle is not essentially about a literal battle. It obviously includes a literal battle between the Narnians and the Calormenes and many others, but it's about the battle about interpretation, whose version of Aslan. And it also raises the question, what happens when the presence of Aslan, or God, is not there? What's the battle about? It becomes a battle about an interpretation of Aslan, given the fact the presence of Aslan is not there. So what do people do in these theological, philosophical, exegetical wars when in fact the presence of the ideal is not there, so people are fighting over an interpretation of the ideal, in this case of Aslan. So the Chronicles of Narnia, what's some of the key points in this key significant climax to the Chronicles of Narnia? Well, it begins with Shift, the monkey, and Puzzle, the donkey. They're good friends. The donkey is a pleaser and Shift is a manipulator, and they're together, and it's a very dysfunctional relationship in many ways. The names are significant. They're together, and Shift spots a skin in the water. It reminds him a lot, or what he thinks is the skin of a lion, tame lion, or the real lion. But anyway, the story goes on that Shift is shifty. You can't pin Shifty down, and this is very important to understand the two between Puzzle and Shift, because Shift will constantly be changing his agenda or his interpretation. And because Puzzle is always puzzled and he's a pleaser, you get this dysfunctional way of relating. And so what inevitably occurs is then Shift notices the skin in the water, and he suggests that this could be important to get, but for him to go into the water, he could drown. It might be too difficult. But the donkey, Puzzle, he's got the strength to go into the currents, the foaming water, to pull it up. Inevitably, of course, what happens is the skin is brought up. It's the lion's skin. And Shift, being shifty the way he is, interpreting things to suit his own interest and to get what he wants. And Puzzle, always being puzzled, he's a pleaser, so he just does what he's essentially told to please Shift. He goes to town eventually to get some food for the ape Shift. When he comes back, in the meantime, what Shift has done, he stitched together the skin that he then puts on the donkey, Puzzle. And Puzzle is initially confused because the idea of being the image of the lion, he has enough of a history to know there is Aslan the lion, and he's very hesitant, but he's puzzled. He doesn't have any sense of what is right or wrong that he'll take a stand on, and so he just fits into the ever shifty Shift in this situation. So what Shift does then, of course, they go up to the stable, and at the nighttime, what he does is the donkey then comes out dressed like the lion, or like Aslan. And so Many of the animals of Narnia just assume that, in fact, Aslan has returned. But Aslan is beginning to make all sorts of requests of the Narnians that is very unlike Aslan. The king of the time, Tyrion, and Jewel, his horse, have gone on a bit of a royal vacation, just a break from royal duties. But two messengers come to them. One is the centaur that says, the stars are telling me that something disastrous is afoot. And Tyrion and Jewel say, well, can you trust the stars? We see only good occurring. They're very optimistic mood. And the centaur says, the stars don't lie. We read the stars. You can almost get here Lewis very much drawing on the notion of the constellations and the truth in the stars and the great myths that the stars revealed. And then a dryad comes. And of course, they're the spirit of the trees. And she tells again, Jewel and Tyrion, that the trees are being torn down, they're being cut down. And as she's telling them that she herself, as the spirit of the tree, collapses and dies. What she tells them, though, is she says that Aslan is commanding people to cut down the trees, to destroy the forests. And this is a bit confusing for both Tyrion and Jewel, because this is not a usual command of Aslan to destroy the forests, the spirit of the trees. The stars apparently are saying something is disastrous, almost apocalyptic afoot. But what has happened is in fact because the donkey keeps appearing at night by a fire. Of course, this is a key element also, is that no one is actually getting close to the donkey in the lion's skin. So it's from a great distance that he only comes out occasionally and then goes back into the stable. But the tricky thing here is that the commands of the donkey with the lion's skin via shift is that Aslan has commanded that the trees, the forests be destroyed, is that Narnians, talking horses and others, are to be sent to hauling logs, to tearing down forests, and they're to become slaves. And this all runs contrary to the Narnians' notion of Aslan, and yet they see what they see visually, so the senses are important here. They think they see Aslan, but the ape is interpreting Aslan, and he's saying this is Aslan, and Aslan is tired of being merciful, of kind. The time has come when Aslan demands that the Narnians obey. Meanwhile, behind the scene, the ape has developed close relationships with the Kellermines, which are seen as the enemies of Narnia itself. And so the question becomes, in the early chapters of the last battle, which is really the battle of interpretation, is whose version of God? So what happens when people claim that in fact they're speaking for God, and yet the content of what they're speaking about is the opposite of an understanding of who God is? The difficulty also is that people have understandings of who Aslan is, i.e. God is, but without the presence or the reality of Aslan. Much of the last battle, in fact, Aslan is not there. Aslan is absent. He only appears in the last couple of chapters in the last battle. And so what the last battle really is, it's a hermeneutical battle about who interprets Aslan or God, and how is that to be done. And the donkey who seems to be in wearing the skin of Aslan, the commands that are coming about seem to be so contrary to an understanding of who God is, and yet the name of Aslan is being used. And so if Aslan's name is being used and they think they're seeing the real Aslan, then they must obey. And so there's this real confusion in the early chapters of the last battle between the image of Aslan, the lack of presence of Aslan, and whose interpretation of Aslan. And so much of the story unfolds in this sense again and again of Aslan appearing, or what seems to be Aslan, then disappearing, the ape shifting, ever shifting the stories of how that's to be interpreted, the donkey wearing the skin of Aslan, but always disappearing. And when people want to actually get closer to do an investigation, then the ape will say, well, if you do, then Aslan will be angry. Aslan is tired of being kind, tired of being merciful, but they can't speak to Aslan, so you have someone else interpreting who that is. And so the Narnian, particularly the talking animals, whether it's the mice or the moles or the boars or the bears or the squirrels, whatever, the dogs, they're so fooled by the language of Aslan being used, the seeming reality of Aslan being there, and yet the content of the interpretation seems to run contrary to their understanding of Aslan. And yet there is no presence of the real Aslan, so all they have is a counterfeit image, which they confuse with reality. And so Lewis is really working, really massaging in the early chapters. This is really the last battle in terms of the one of whose interpretation of Aslan, or God, and how do we know the real from the false, the counterfeit from the substantive, when there is no real presence of Aslan, but it's just an interpretive war, or the last battle in that sense, over who speaks for Aslan. And much of, in fact, the last battle is this ongoing journey of deconstructing certain false images of Aslan that are assumed to be the real, but the content of the Aslan that the ape and the Calormenes and many others are portraying runs contrary to a memory the Narnians have of Aslan, but there's no presence of Aslan to verify or falsify this. All they have is the name, i.e. God, but then the question, whose interpretation of God, and how can that be manipulated to serve certain interests? And then, of course, much of the story as it unfolds, it's again and again, the ape is very much in league with the Calormenes. As the story unfolds, which is quite interesting, of course, is that as it sort of reaches mid-stride near the end, and it becomes clear that in fact the donkey in the lion skin is not Aslan. Tyrion and some of the kids actually coming from the other world into Narnia managed to free Jewel. They managed to get the donkey out of the stable. The skin comes off. And it becomes very clear, but the dwarves are very interested in this because they have been fooled once, in this sense, by the counterfeit Aslan. So the question, and fooled once, who can I believe again? So the dwarves, as they say, the dwarves are for the dwarves. They're not going to believe the Narnians, and they're not going to believe the Calormenes. And so the dwarves become a metaphor for Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, of people who once trusted, once believed, were betrayed by counterfeits, so they're not going to believe anyone again. Your typical cynics who retreat from believing anything because they have been betrayed by counterfeits, by lies. And so the dwarves are a key figure in the last battle of a type of person who becomes cynical and skeptical because once burnt, given a view of Aslan, given a view of God, which distorts the reality, but there's no real presence to confirm what that reality is. It's a battle over ideas, essentially. And as I said earlier, Aslan doesn't appear until the end. And so people are struggling over, so is cynicism the answer? Is the belief in the noble ideal the answer? But how do you know it's real if there's not the presence? Or is in fact multiple misinterpretations of Aslan, of God? What do you do with the pluralism in that sense of diverse interpretations? As the story unfolds, of course, what happens, and many people have objected to this position by Lewis, is at the end, as the literal battle is coming to an end, the question often is, and this is where the issue of, say, variations of universal salvation or hopeful universalism comes in, is that Emeth, a Calormene, who's often seen as the enemy of the Narnians, they go through the small stable, which is a very interesting, again, metaphor. What seems to be the end of reality, this little world, in fact, is the opening to a far bigger world. So often What seems to be a small little gate one has to go through, a small little reality, is in fact opens one up to a magnificent magical reality, far bigger than we could possibly imagine or dream, which the final version of the last battle really is about. But Emeth, who one would think within a certain understanding of Christianity and other religions, is in fact comes from the opposite end of the spectrum, a threat to the Narnians or the true faith in that sense. But Emeth was always searching for the truth, always searching for that. I was fortunate near the end of Med Manzalawi's life, who in fact Emeth was patterned after. He taught at University of British Columbia for much of his life. He was a student of C.S. Lewis, and then he came out west and taught medieval and Arabic literature, and I spent time with him before he died a few years ago, and he mentioned that very, very much that the Emeth, he was Muslim, Med Manzalawi from Egypt. It was Emeth was patterned after him, and Med wrote a variety of letters, articles actually on Lewis and his relationship with Lewis. But here you have Lewis with Emeth. Here you have people, as long as they're searching for the light, the truth, in fact, they are welcome to Narnia. And just because a person's from another background, as long as they're doing the best they can with the light they have been given, they enter the fullness of the new Narnia. It's the same with the donkey, who seems to innocently, naively wear the lion's robe, which you think would be someone who would be one that would be opposed, rejected as a counterfeit, distorting reality. Aslan welcomes him as someone who is naive, puzzled, somewhat immature, but his heart was good, the donkey's heart. So he is welcomed into the new Narnia. And interestingly, one of the dwarves who killed some of the talking horses, again, you get in the final resolution to the last battle, these ones are welcomed into the new Narnia. As the old dies, the new emerges from it. And so you get in Lewis this openness to where there is the longing to follow the light that has been given. They will be given yet greater light in that sense. But those who retreat from the fray, if they have the light, may end up in a certain place as they go through the door, and those who follow Tash in this sense. The other thing which is important to get, and this I'll just close with that, is that often what Lewis is doing in the last battle, it's a battle over names. So is Tash Aslan? Is Aslan Tash? Are they the same? Is Tashlan are the same? Are these just different names of the same thing? What Lewis points out is we can talk about names, we can fight over names and interpreting these different names, but what's the presence? Is there a presence back of the names, or is it just a battle over names in which you really have no idea what the reality of those names signifies? Lewis makes it clear that Tash is a dark demonic figure, destructive in many ways. And Aslan, obviously, is the good, the being of mercy, the being who brings goodness, health to the forests, cares for the here you have obviously Lewis dealing with the natural world, the forests, the animals, a very healthy understanding of what we would call early human rights activists in some ways. We get the same thing in Tolkien with the Ents in that sense. And so in the last battle then, what is the relationship? And we get this sometimes in religious syncretism. Well, God, the Judeo-Christian God, is no different from the Islamic God, Allah, or you move into Eastern religions. And so people grapple with these different interpretations of what they see is ultimate reality. And if there is no presence in any way, all it is becomes a struggle over whose interpretation of the ultimate as it applies to the penultimate. What Lewis is pointing out is that names do emerge from presences, or appearances, or incarnations of the very name itself. So those who get stuck at the name, as does the ape to some degree, as does the Calormines, for Sim, these religious names are just words, and back of it is the fight for political power. So if you have to use the language of religion, the language of the ultimate, sure, do it, but you don't believe in it really, like the dwarves themselves. There's nothing really there. But if you can use religion to serve power, as we often see going on today, fine. But at the end of the last battle is, in fact, These names do emerge from historic encounters with the presence of what those names signify. So back of the actual names, the metaphors is an incarnated presence, either for good, for mediocre, for shallow, or for evil. And so it's not, the name itself is meant to embody a presence, but what do people do when in fact the actual presence is not there? And then you can have the multiple counterfeits of the presence. So the last battle then, as I mentioned, is very, very much about the battle of interpretation and who should be heeded and why. And in that sense, the last battle is a perennial book that is much with us today as was when it was written.